sometimes people in the West look at the Gulf and they say, oh, there's no politics. But in fact, it may just be a less institutionalized politics than we're used to.
You've done a lot of work on the politics of countries around the Gulf, how political expression and ideas are exchanged in different ways. Could you share some of your insights?
Yeah, certainly. I think when it comes to the Gulf, a lot of the scholarship has been focused on oil wealth and how oil wealth affects political life, which I think is problematic. It stresses the economic above ideology, above political activism, all kinds of things that do exist in the Gulf, and we see quite clearly. And so I think there's been a focus on the one hand on oil wealth, and the other hand on kind of foreign policy and security issues, all of which are important. But I think oftentimes this is at the detriment of talking about domestic political life. And I think when it comes to domestic political life in the Gulf, sometimes people in the West look at the Gulf and they say, oh, there's no politics. But in fact, it may just be a less institutionalized politics than we're used to. The institutions of political life here are different. And that's not necessarily because of oil wealth, it's because of the histories of these countries, the way they work, the sizes, these countries, the way they're ruled. And so political life here does look different. And so some of my work is exceptionalizing the Gulf in terms of political structures, but also de-exceptionalizing it in terms of talking about political ideologies which cross borders throughout the Middle East and throughout the world more broadly.
Very interesting. And you've worked in a number of Gulf countries, worked on a number of Gulf countries, Qatar, but also Kuwait. Could you maybe talk about some of the differences from that perspective between those countries?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, so I lived in Qatar back in 2010. We were talking about this. It's changed quite a bit, and Kuwait has as well. I mean, I guess the biggest difference between these two is in Kuwait, parliamentary life is really at the center of political life. You have a very active parliament right now, quite oppositional, and so you have a lot of interpellations of ministers, a lot of interrogation of kind of how the government is doing there, which is much more public than what we see in Qatar. So I think the political structures are different in that sense. Also, I mean, in terms of regional roles, they act a bit differently. I mean, Qatar has always been accused of, I hate this term, punching above its weight. I think it's just being a regional actor. And Kuwait also is very important as a regional actor, but is, I guess, in recent years played much more of a role in mediating. Of course, Qatar has played this role more in the past, and actually now, still with the Taliban talks, continues mediating. So I think they're both similar in terms of hoping to mediate, hoping to bring together sides, especially in kind of the Gulf conflict going on now. And so I think they're an interesting comparison, and both places that are fantastic to study, because you do have a variety of political ideologies that exist, and a variety of really interesting figures to speak to in both countries.
What do you think it is about Qatar and Kuwait that uniquely singles them out as mediators in the region and beyond? And then what differences do you see also?
Interesting question. I mean, I think they're seen as neutral, and so this places them well to be mediators. A lot of the conflicts in which these states have gotten involved are states in which they don't really have a dog in the fight, and so they're able to be seen as very neutral arbiters of basically resolving conflict. So I think that's quite important. Also, I think they're not vassals of kind of any other larger regional powers. You don't have concerns that, for instance, they're doing the bidding of another country. They have their own foreign policies that are very much set out. The agendas are set in those countries. But at the same time, mediation is very much, I think at the center for both of them. In terms of differences, I guess, I mean, in Kuwait you have the figure of Sheikh Sabah, who has been central to foreign policy making in Kuwait for decades. Of course, prior to being emir, he was the foreign minister. And so he's been formulating and I think cultivating this image of Kuwait as a regional mediator for decades, which I think has been very important for the country, very important for the GCC. And so I think that's one way in which they're different. You've had the change from Sheikh Hamad to Sheikh Tamim here in 2013. And so since that time, we've seen slight changes, or some changes in Qatari foreign policy, whereas in Kuwait, you've had more of this building up of this mediation agenda, I think, under the umbrella of kind of one figure who is very much respected throughout the Gulf. In Qatar, of course, Sheikh Hamad and Sheikh Tamim both very well respected throughout the Gulf, but slightly different in terms of style. I think Sheikh Hamad was really put Qatar on a global stage in a way that it hadn't been previously. And now Sheikh Tamim is carrying that on. And yeah, that's it.
And so, as we've also been talking about Kuwait, obviously, you know that with the recent change in government, some of the dynamics may change there. What is your take on some of the recent political developments in Kuwait just over the past few months?
So recently in Kuwait, I mean, I was actually there last month when there was an anti-corruption protest, which was called for. It was held kind of across the street from Parliament. It was actually quite nice to see peaceful protests happening in the Gulf, which I think a lot of times people don't realize that this happens, that people do speak their minds, they do protest, they have political ideas and they express them. And so there was kind of this anti-corruption protest, which also turned into a protest as well about new proposed legislation to resolve the Bidoon issue in Kuwait. And so in addition to that, I mean, kind of, and following on to that, we see a cabinet reshuffle. There were interpellations in Parliament of two ministers, one more related to corruption, another related to infrastructure failures during flooding last year. So we have this new cabinet reshuffle, and I think it will be interesting to see, you know, we're still not sure who will be appointed yet. But it's an opportunity, I think, for a new cabinet that will be more palatable to the opposition in Parliament. I think the last cabinet faced a lot of problems from members of Parliament, which is largely oppositional today in Kuwait. And so Kuwait is very interesting. You get this interplay between cabinet and Parliament, often played out quite publicly through these parliamentary questioning sessions. And so that's what we've seen last month. And so now in the coming days, I think we'll see the appointment of a new cabinet there. And the composition of that, I think, will tell us the extent to which this cabinet will kind of play ball with the opposition in Parliament.
Very interesting. And so just carrying on the Kuwait theme, obviously there's also going to be a new Secretary General of the GCC. How do you think that with him being obviously a Kuwaiti, how do you think that might change some of the dynamics within the GCC?
I mean, I think this further bolsters Kuwait's role as a mediator, as not only a regional mediator, but potentially on a global stage more broadly. I think that it's a good thing for the region and for the GCC specifically to have Kuwait have this kind of a position, which is quite visible, quite powerful, and so I think it's a positive thing, and will only really advance Kuwait's role and also its gravitas as well when it comes to potentially resolving the blockade that's happened in the GCC.